So we have already seen the definitions of candidate intents, target intents, as well as fallback intents. In this video, I am going to talk about what I define as surplus intents. So what is a surplus intent? As the name indicates, the surplus intent is an intent which is a candidate but one which you prefer does not fire. In other words, it's just a surplus and you would rather that it's not even a candidate at that point. So we have already run into surplus intents before when we were discussing the follow-up intent tree over here. So let's say that the user types, I want to buy a submarine, and it comes back with what is your first name, and you say Adam, and then it says. So you can see that it is asking for the what is your last name second time, and I think we already went over the reason for this, and the reason was that the context which was set by the user wants to buy submarine is still active after this intent has mapped, which means that instead of firing this user wants to buy submarine last name intent, which should have captured the last name, it simply fired this user wants to buy submarine hyphen first name intent again. Now at this point, if you think about it, what we wanted was, this was our target intent. At the same time, aside from the intents which don't have any input context at all, you will also remember that because of the way the follow-up intent tree works in Dialogflow, this also is a candidate intent simply because it shares the input context with this one. That is, these two are both having input context which are technically active at the point in the conversation where user is typing in this word Scott. Now that means even though we would prefer user wants to buy submarine hyphen last name to fire, the actual intent which fires, as you can see, is this one, which is user wants to buy submarine hyphen first name. So in this situation, user wants to buy submarine hyphen first name is the surplus intent. So this is what I mean when I say a surplus intent. It is a candidate because of the fact that it's got, it's got like the context set in that way. But it's not something that is actually a target, and we prefer that it doesn't fire at that point. Now, I would not call the intents which don't have any input context as surplus intents simply because there are some situations when you have no option. An example would be like an FAQ chatbot which answers frequently asked questions. And for the most part, the user, when they come in and they type a question, there are like, let's say there are 10 types of questions. For each question, you cannot really set an input context simply because there isn't, that could well be the starting point of the conversation for the user. And if you had set an input context, that means obviously those intents cannot fire at the beginning of the conversation. So that's not what I would refer to as the surplus intent. What I am really talking about when I mean surplus intent are the intents like the user wants to buy submarine hyphen first name, which do have a context and still end up as surplus intents. That is, which do have an input context set and still end up as candidates when they should not be. Those are the ones which I am referring to as surplus intents. So going over the list we already have, we talked about the candidate intents, which are all the intents which could fire at any given step in the conversation. We had the target intents, which are the intents which we actually wanted to fire at any step in the conversation. We had the fallbacks where we didn't know how to handle the user's input. And finally, we have the surplus intents, which are those which we prefer should not be candidates at a given step in the conversation. So we will be using these concepts, and we will use these as the basis for deciding how we will be building our chatbots in a more predictable fashion.